I will just begin with a reading. It's from chapter 7 of the novel. I guess I should say, for those who don't know, there are two main protagonists in the novel. One is a young man from Kinshasa in the Democratic Republic of Congo named Arès, and the other one is Simon, who is a young employee at the UN Refugee Bureau in Morocco, in the capital, which is Rabat. And so this is the first time Simon appears, and yeah, I will read. It'll take about 10 minutes, and then I'll talk a little bit about the novel and how it came to be and what the writing process was like. So, chapter 7, February 2008. Simon skipped up the stairs, a thick pink folder rolled hard against his thighs. His very first resettlement interview, and it was a credible case for submission. What were the odds? He paused on the landing and smoothed his hands over the rumpled sides of his blazer. He had carried himself well, he thought. He had dressed smart, exuded authority. Sure, he had scraped his chair a bit excitedly against the floor, twice, maybe 3 times, but he had been adept, in control. Had he fidgeted? He didn't think so. In any case, the PRA had no way of knowing it was his first unassisted interview. What a rush. He reached the top of the stairs and proceeded down a glittering white hall, his tasseled brown loafers skating over the smooth tiled floors. Odd that the refugee was his same age, down to the day. Of course, you can never really be sure with them. The birthdays they gave were often fanciful. It could be a name day or a national holiday or some arbitrary date plucked out of thin air, which had special meaning for them or no meaning whatsoever. Could they really be the same age? He paused in front of a reflective brass plate mounted beside one of the office doors. His face stared back at him, polished in liquid gold. Long, thick locks of dirty blonde hair tumbled over a high golden forehead. Gold blue eyes flecked with chips of flaxen brown, a gilded aquiline nose with a small golden knob on the ridge, not a mark or blemish on his baby smooth golden skin. Promising features, he thought. Dynamic, commanding, executive. The man he had just interviewed was of a different sort, his chocolate brown skin pockmarked with fever blisters, the wide bridge of his nose puffed awry with the signs of several bashings, his eyes 2 liquid sinks webbed with pink veins, his cheeks hollowed by malnutrition. And that scar, like a serpent wriggling through grass. Could he really be 28 years old? His forehead seemed furrowed with misery. Perhaps that explained the subject's noncompliance during the interview. Simon had looked a tad young to his eyes. Despite the sober suit, despite the stranglehold tie that he wrenched open as he burst onto the bright white terrace of the 2nd floor of the UNHCR. But he had presided over that stifling room, an unflinching rod of authority, while dribbles of sweat tickled his spine. And resettlement. He had already begun drafting the RRF in his head. What were the elements of the claim? Lack of local integration, victim of torture or violence, urgent medical condition with no access to adequate treatment. Was there any exclusion criteria? Record of combat, criminal activity, special needs assessment? He would have to review the resettlement handbook. Where would he apply first? Sweden. That was the low-hanging fruit. Or maybe France. The PRA was a French speaker. He would integrate better there. The French, though, were finicky. They looked for any excuse to reject an RRF. But this one was sound. Certainly there were inconsistencies in the account, minor ones. It was always like that. He had sat in on nearly a dozen interviews and the subjects were constantly tripping over themselves. Most of the time, their stories defied good sense, not to mention the laws of continuity. It was exasperating. They jumped from one event to another without obvious causal connection, like in some art house film. But the UNHCR guidelines encourage a principle of benefit of the doubt. so long as the applicant's claims were coherent and plausible. And coherent and plausible wore entirely different dress in Africa. But this one was different. He had pushed back, turned aside the current of the interview. What a dramatic tale, like something out of Shakespeare, or older, less plotted, more disjointed. The Odyssey, perhaps. Africa with its fetishes and fallen kingdoms, der Mensch tragt und Gott lacht, as his grandfather used to say. If he hadn't lived in Rwanda, hadn't seen those cartloads of carved talismans coming over from the Congo, those rows of twice-faced forest idols and waist-high masks, dementing laughing charms, and Nkizi nail totems, all bred out of that endless bush as if the jungle were the foundry of dreams. Well, it all belonged to another world. He stopped suddenly, shielding his eyes, blinking furiously as pulses of light crashed against his retinas like waves on the shore. Slowly, the second floor terrace dimmed into view. The roar of a crowd filled his ears, and the empty whack and skid of a polyurethane ball against shorn grass. Baptiste, a UN officer from Yaoundé, was camped in front of an open laptop. The computer sat on a Victorian-style table of wrought iron, painted an antique white. Above it spread the twisting branches of an olive tree, bathing Baptiste in a fluctuating web of shadow and light. A handsome man with coppery brown skin and trim, neat features. Per usual, he was dressed more for the nightclub than the office. Today it was a tailored three-piece suit, a white cutaway shirt, and a black pencil tie. Baptiste held his face fanatically close to the screen, his brow creased with the heroic concentration normally reserved for a duel. "You're watching soccer?" Simon asked as he stepped towards the table. Baptiste glanced up. "This isn't soccer, mon ami. This is poetry with a ball. This is ballet on grass. I am watching the Africa Cup, and once again, the indomitable lions are devouring their opponents." His large, bright eyes twinkled mischievously, and an infectious Cheshire smile extended far beyond the corners of his mouth. When he leaned back in the chair, Simon noticed a surprisingly gaudy green and gold handkerchief with the roaring snout of a lion poking above the edge of his breast pocket. "Who are they playing?" "They are up against the Black Stars, but I'm afraid the Ghanaians have eaten too much fufu again. They're waddling around the pitch like pregnant women. And look at Essien. It's embarrassing that the Lions are only ahead by 1 goal when Ghana's best player is a pigeon-toed gorilla who keeps tripping over the ball." Baptiste slapped the table and took a hurried sip from a can of cherry cola, one eye still on the screen. "So much for African solidarity," Simon remarked with a grin. "If you spent less time planning weekends in Ibiza and more time reading African history, you would know that we are not a continent renowned for its abiding solidarity," Baptiste replied, and then inched even closer to the laptop screen. Simon's jaw dropped. "That was 2 weeks ago," he protested, "and I spent most of the time on the beach reading King Leopold's Ghost." "A perfect place to ponder a century of enslavement, expropriation, and mass murder," Baptiste added with a half smile. Simon felt his cheeks burn. "But if you excuse me, I'm occupied with another massacre. The Ghanaians will be weeping and tearing their hair after this game. It is a national tragedy." "I just finished my first resettlement interviews," Simon announced. Baptiste sighed and lowered the sound on the computer. "How did it go?" He leaned back in his chair and regarded the young JPO for the first time. Simon smoothed back his mane of blonde hair and leaned towards the Cameroonian officer. "I think we have a solid case for resettlement." "So we bamboozled you," Baptiste responded without missing a beat. "What do you mean?" The color leached out of Simon's face. "I felt that way too after my first few interviews. Then reality settled in." "I'm no novice," Simon said. "I've already sat through several interviews with you and Hilda. Most of them are a mess, but this one was coherent, and the refugee suffers from an urgent medical condition." "You know they swap stories in the refugee community," Baptiste replied. "That's why so many of their accounts resemble one another. I'm not saying they haven't undergone terrible experiences, But when you've heard the same general biography with a few details tweaked here or there from dozens of applicants, you grow a bit cynical. Then you start to probe and suddenly none of it adds up. Sit down. Simon slapped the pink dossier onto the table, spun a chair around and sat akimbo, his arms folded over the ridge of the back. Well, I've never heard a story like this one before. Baptiste raised his eyebrows. Where is he from? The DRC. Minority population, Bwanyamulenge? Of course, Simon replied. Let me guess. He saw his family killed before his very eyes. How did you know? Typical. You don't think it happened? Well, how did he escape? If everyone in his family was killed, then why is he alive? There's only two ways. One is that he took part in the killing to save his own skin. That's not uncommon. They forced one of the victims to murder the others. But that means he falls into an exclusion category. Or let me guess, he doesn't know how he was saved. The latter, Simon answered grudgingly. What happened? He was knocked unconscious and was carried to safety by an unknown individual about whom he has sparse details, if any. Simon nodded. He could feel the heat rise up the back of his neck. I've heard this one before. Yes, but it was the rest of what he told me, Simon insisted. It was spontaneous, credible, and like nothing I've ever heard. I think that's a pretty good place to stop in the reading. I picked that excerpt, one, because it introduces Simon and it introduces you to the UNHCR in Morocco, and it kind of shows you some of the themes that the book will develop, which is this question of, who are these people coming that are claiming to be refugees? It looks at the kind of UN's work, day-to-day work, where you have to decide whether these people are telling the truth or not. And, you know, the people who are charged with that, who are tasked with that, are people like myself or, you know, this officer from Cameroon, but they have to figure out if people from very different countries with very different customs are telling the truth. And it shows some of the cynicism of individuals who've been working at the UN for a long time, who've dealt with a bunch of these asylum interviews, versus Simon, who's this young, naive employee at the UN who kind of believes everything that is told to him. And then it's obviously, he's just interviewed Arès, who's the other main character in the novel, who barely escapes ethnic killings in Kinshasa that happened in the late 90s, and ends up making his way to Morocco and applying to be a refugee there. And, you know, the other half of the book tells his story and how he came to be there and what happens next. So to talk about why, you know, someone from East Hampton might end up writing this book, like myself, in 2009, I worked, well, I guess to dive back a little bit, I did a double law degree, which was 2 years at Columbia and 2 years in France. And during some time I took off, I went on a 6-month mission to Morocco and worked at the Refugee Bureau of the UN in 2009. And at the time, most of the refugees there were Congolese from the Democratic Republic of Congo. There's obviously 2 Congos, and from the Ivory Coast. And this summer, a book didn't come into my head. I was just kind of working with them. I was doing these asylum interviews. I was in community services as well, which meant visiting them where they lived and helping them out when, you know, they needed medical care or they needed to find work or what have you. But, you know, I came to know a lot of people, and because I was in community services, I worked closely with them. And the summer, the mission ended in a very dramatic fashion in July 2009, which initiated with 2 weeks of protests by almost the entire refugee community in Morocco, which was at the time almost 2,000 refugees, and they were demanding resettlement to Europe. And the basis of their demands was that life was just unbearable in Morocco. And, you know, they had a lot of how would you say, they had good basis in a certain sense for this claim. I mean, Morocco is, I don't like to call it a racist country, but there's a lot of racism there towards people from sub-Saharan Africa, which is obviously anyone who's Black, though also from Southern Moroccans who are Berber, who also have darker skin. Many of the refugees were harassed and attacked in the street, and the response of the authorities was not to necessarily listen to their demands, but to kind of clean out the protests. And then 3 days later, about 60 or 70 refugees arrived carrying weapons and rocks, and they attacked the building during daytime hours when we were all inside, and they broke all the windows and the security cameras. And we're about to break down the front gate, which was being held back by guards. We had to evacuate in a dramatic fashion and kind of climb onto the roof and jump onto another building, and kind of run for our lives. And then the Moroccan army came and attacked the people who were attacking the building, and, you know, dozens of people were injured. I mean, it was a disaster, so to speak, and also, you know, perplexing in a certain sense. I mean, how did we come to a place where, you know, dozens of individuals would attack the very institution that was meant to protect them? So, you know, to tell that story and to also tell the story of what it was like working there, and, you know, what the scene was like in Morocco at that time, I decided to write this novel. And to do that effectively, I needed to tell the story of one of the people who ends up taking part in that attack, which is Arès, and where he came from and how he ended up a refugee, and, you know, why would they reach this point of desperation. But it's not a purely political novel, and I don't want to sell it as that. You know, it's also a tale of adventure in a certain sense. And I like the cover a lot. We worked on this a lot. It's supposed to kind of capture some of the sense of those 19th century adventure novels, you know, something you can imagine like Jules Verne. I mean, there's
Right.
little scenes from Arès's life,
Like The Southern Star by Jules Verne. That one,
yeah,
definitely, that's an adventure along the Ivory Coast. And
right, exactly.
that has, well, the originals had, you know, the very illustrated adventure style cover. And I mean, that's a great cover. I mean, you have the office down there in the desert and the backdrop, and
Yeah, so Arès kind of facing off against the UNHCR. He ends up fisherman for a bit of time. This is when he gets to Rabat in Morocco. This is the Trans-Saharan Highway, which is the main migration route from Central Africa to North. This is obviously trying to cross the Mediterranean. And this is a very famous place in Morocco. There's 2 Spanish cities in Morocco, so they're actually part of Europe, and there's a place where migrants and refugees try to break through the barriers and get in. And that's also in the excerpt that I read. You know, Simon, when he does his first resettlement interview and he hears this story, his references are Shakespeare or the Odyssey, in a sense. I mean, migrants and refugees, and especially African ones, though, what have you, are somehow the heroes of the modern era, in a sense. I mean, they're taking the journeys that, for many of us, our forefathers took, or our ancestors, but are also journeys that are recounted in books like the Odyssey or in Jules Verne novels, though oftentimes they're specifically off for adventure. But yeah, one thing, so making the film that I put in the chat for The Guardian, I spent several months on the French-Italian border, and there's, tons of, in this case, really refugees coming from Eastern Africa, especially from Eritrea. And one thing that struck me is that, they very clearly fall into the parameters of who is a refugee versus a migrant, but most of them are young men. And even though they're fleeing dictatorship or war, what have you, they're also young men out on a journey discovering the world. And I didn't want to lose sight of this, that even if we flee tragedy, there's still that, especially for a young person, journeying for the first time, they have this, you know, this sense of exploration and also coming of age. And in many ways, The Fire in His Wake is a, you know, is a novel about two young people coming of age in very dramatic circumstances. So that's what the cover is supposed to capture as well. That this is not a treatise. This is really a story.
Excellent. I would like to right now just open the floor if anyone has any questions about the novel, or any questions for Spencer about writing. You can type it in the chat if you'd like, or use the raise hand feature, or if you just would like to unmute your mic, by all means, you know, you're welcome to do so. So how long you were working at that in the UN for? Like,
So I was there for 6 months. Actually, it ended up being only slightly over 5 months because the UN was shut down after the attack. It was shut down for several weeks, so my mission kind of ended abruptly, but it should have been for just under 6 months. Yeah, and we should remember that at that time in 2009, this was before the collapse of Libya. So Morocco was the main transit country to Europe. People were taking boats, especially in northern Morocco. It's a very wild, mountainous part of the country. That's because it was historically, there were, you know, Morocco was divided into French and Spanish protectorates, and the north, which is called the Rift Valley, was Spanish at the time and became this sort of, you know, wild outlaw landscape, and it's never really come under control. So a lot of smugglers like to leave from that northern section. So there were thousands and thousands of people coming through, most of whom obviously were not applying for refugee status. They were, you know, going through and hoping to make their way to Spain, and they were from all parts of Central Africa, though again, you know, people who were recognized as refugees, people who were seen to have valid refugee claims, tend to be either from the Democratic Republic of Congo, because a lot of people fled when Mobutu's regime collapsed in 1997, 1998, and it just took years for them to make it north, and then from the Ivory Coast with the Civil War, many of whom went back later on.
There's also along the Ivory Coast, is that where the diamond trade is along there?
Yeah, the blood diamond.
Yeah, and there's probably a lot of people who want to escape the regimes and just what goes on with you know, people trying to excavate those diamonds illegally. But do you find, like, with now, I mean, in that particular situation, dealing with mainly along the Congo and the Ivory Coast, but if you apply it to, say, South America, do you see sort of similarities with people trying to seek asylum? I think that, you know, I hear these stories of the people, what they're facing in their villages, and how, you know, there's literally people after them and they want them to join gangs, and they're trying to seek asylum and get into the United States. And the excerpt that you read kind of had a little bit of the gentleman was, you know, it was hard to believe he was 28. He had the ravages of time on him when he was just still 28. And do you find, like, there's similarities where people who are trying to seek asylum, you know, to get into a country because they really have a valid point now, or they're just, you know, want to get in just to...
Yeah, so I guess, I mean, we should say something about the difference between asylum law and, you know, these distinctions that I find oftentimes spurious between who is an economic migrant, who's a migrant fleeing what's called generalized violence, and who is recognized as a refugee. And the problem is people simply fleeing violence most of the time are not counted as refugees. The kind of definition, the definition to recognize a refugee is it must be a person who has a well-founded fear of persecution based on one of 5 or 6 categories, which is persecution on the basis of sex, religion, ethnicity, political belief, orientation, obviously, gender. I feel like I'm missing one, but it's not someone who's simply fleeing, who has, if someone's being threatened by a gang, unfortunately, they're not counted as a refugee. If somebody, if the mafia has put out a hit on you and you flee Italy, you are not a refugee, even though you could be killed if you're sent back. So it's very rare, unless in a war, you can show that ethnic factions are fighting, and there's a lot of discussion of this in the novel, and there's a lot of cynical UN workers who kind of dig into these contradictions. I mean, why should someone fleeing a famine, for instance, be sent back? But if the famine gives rise to ethnic killings over a lack of resources, which is what happened in Darfur, for instance, partially. But I have a scene where they kind of discuss that, the famine gives rise to ethnic killings, then suddenly these people are transformed into refugees if they're fleeing those ethnic killings. And then if they're reprisal killings from one ethnicity against the other one that started killing them, then the killers are, or at least the civilians linked to the killer's ethnicity are also now refugees. But if all these people had just fled the famine to begin with, they would not be refugees. These are very... It's
almost like a catch-22 in a sense.
Yeah, I mean, when the discussions originally happened after World War II, and there's the convention, the first convention was in 1951, it was the Cold War, or it was the beginning of the Cold War, and the kind of Soviet-aligned states all wanted to include economic migrants, and the US and the Western powers refused. They didn't want to open the floodgates, as they called it. And then, there's a lot of very good arguments to go back to South America. I mean, there's especially good arguments that much of this violence is gendered. There's a lot of violence, there's a lot of, if you look at El Salvador, Honduras, or maybe the killings in Mexico with the school children, a lot of that can be, actually, I think the 43 children who disappeared in Mexico were not women, but there's a lot of gendered violence. So you would think that should be a good asylum claim, but oftentimes it's rejected. And then, working at the UN, and especially Morocco, it's very complicated. I'm getting some questions if I'm still involved with the refugees, Syrians, Afghanistans, or Lesbos, where the Moira camp just burned down. I mean, I am and I'm not. I'm more as a filmmaker, so I've been dealing with that kind of filming and on the French-Italian border. There's actually an amazing group called East End Cares, which was sending a bunch of East Hampton rescue workers and Long Island rescue workers to Lesbos. And I actually pitched a documentary about them to The Guardian, which said no, unfortunately. But I have not been dealing with the Syrian situation. And I'm still very much in contact with this farmer in France and his organization that are helping a lot of African refugees, mainly from East and Central Africa. So yes, I'm still very much involved, but not as part of the UNHCR. But I was saying, yes, in regards to South America, there's this larger question about whether, when we know people are fleeing situations of extreme danger if we should demand we should demand that they fit this very particular criteria that was generated after World War II, or we should just recognize people fleeing danger as people seeking asylum in the original sense of the word.
Yeah, I mean, because there are stories of, I mean, I could remember reading about people seeking asylum in the 1970s, from India, or Pakistan, and they were seeking asylum in England. And you had, in the early 70s, there was like, you know, an influx of people coming from there to England. And I remember there was, I think it was maybe in the 90s, there was Haiti. There was,
there were special exceptions for El Salvador at a certain moment.
Yeah, I remember El Salvador was 70, 79, 80, around there. But it's something that comes up quite often, because there's just so many situations of, like the first criteria that you mentioned, the persecution of people based on, you know, religion, race, orientation,
ethnicity. Yeah.
I mean, it's like Saddam Hussein with the Kurds. I mean, you know,
so they would clearly be refugees.
Yeah.
Under that criteria. But, you know, it's funny. I mean, there's that big success and that controversy around that American Dirt novel.
Yeah, the Cummings novel. Yeah.
Yeah, the Cummings novel. But, you know, for instance, I mean, where she has to flee to go north because her husband's killed by this cartel, she would not be a refugee, for instance, which seems insane. I mean, there's a cartel hit out on her because her husband is a journalist and she has to flee to the north. But there's no real pathway for her to apply for asylum. You know, even imagining in the Obama era or previous eras when we were more, you know, welcoming to those sorts of claims. But yeah, I mean, it's, you know, it's a constant world problem. And then, you know, working in Morocco, for instance, to bring it back to the UNHCR there, that's also a very complicated situation, because in most countries, the UN is accepted, and actually, so in the US or most European countries, it's actually government employees who conduct these asylum interviews, you know, what's called a refugee status determination, where the UNHCR in Morocco is not officially accepted in a sense. It's not kind of, it's sort of condoned by the government, but the government won't integrate it. So it has very limited budget, and there's pressure. There was a lot of pressure put on us to only recognize a certain number of people. Because we recognize too many refugee claims, then the government would get angry. And also sub-Saharan Africans, which generally meant, sub-Saharan refugees, which generally meant Black Africans, were not given working rights or residency permits, whereas Northern Africans were, or refugees from the Arab world, Palestinians or Algerians, for instance, and it wasn't even a religious thing. So, you know, a Sudanese Muslim who ended up a refugee in Morocco would not be given working rights or residency visa, which was part of this, why these protests erupted, because they just couldn't, you know, they're recognized as refugees, but they couldn't live. Yeah.
That's interesting. I mean, do you think at some point they might look into redoing the criterions on some of these situations, like taking a closer look, or I should say, do they ever make any exceptions in certain cases?
Yeah, I mean, they do in some ways. I mean, sometimes The UNHCR, when it's working by itself, will make exceptions for generalized violence and kind of short-term recognize the refugees, but then they can be challenged. So, you know, this happened with the Ivory Coast where it was just warfare, and so they just took anyone from it. Or Syria, right now, I mean, everyone's being recognized as refugees, but they don't necessarily, or they were, you know, a few years ago, even though they don't necessarily fall into the criteria. You know, it may be, it's clearly an ethnic conflict or a sectarian conflict. But, you know, they're not doing these kind of long interviews that we had to do in Morocco. I mean, it's just an automatic acceptance, and theoretically that can be challenged later on as the situation changes, and the, you know, national European governments can say, look, you know, things have calmed down in Syria. We're actually are now looking at your dossier, and you know, we're going to send you back. So it's always evolving. I mean, there's this very set criteria, which is mainly about exclusion. And then in these, you know, world crises, sometimes governments just say, look, we're going to take everybody. It's too complicated to administer, and we believe in human rights, and we're just going to, you know, we're going to handle this. But, you know, and that leads, and then the refugees themselves, this is, I mean, it's kind of interesting what catalyzed the protests in Morocco was that actually a situation like that happened where a government, Sweden, I mean, this is an amazing story to think this can actually happen. So in Morocco, shortly before I came, Sweden basically called up the UN Bureau in Morocco and said, hey, we have just some extra spots in our refugee program. Can you send us some refugees? And there's very specific criteria for why you should resettle refugees. And so suddenly they scrambled in Morocco and just kind of sent 50 people to Sweden. And then everyone else who had been denied resettlement because they didn't fit the criteria was just enraged. You know, and so this, you know, they get this impression of arbitrariness on the part of the UN. They think that they're toying with their lives. And so this also leads to problems. Maybe I should say a little something about the writing.
Sure.
Of the book.
The descriptions are, I love the Cheshire smile. It reminds, I'm thinking of the Cheshire cat, you know, in Alice in Wonderland, like the big, with the, but I'm big on descriptions. Like I like, some people say, oh, you know, it's like, there's some writings that are very descriptive, and some people like it just straight through, but I love descriptions, at lots of adjectives, and, you know, writing is it's a tough thing to master, but I mean it what you read flowed beautifully.
Thank you. This was, yeah, I mean, I've been working on this for 10 years. So I started writing it in 2009, when everything was happening. Actually, when the protests started happening, I started taking notes because it seemed so dramatic. Even then, I had no idea it would finish in this cataclysmic attack on the UN. But so, you know, I managed to crib a lot of notes. And luckily, and by accident, one of my flatmates at the time was also Congolese. So we had this kind of wonderful, and he had a bunch of West African friends. I mean, his best friends were from Gabon and Cameroon, so they were all kind of hanging out, and there was a lot of conversation I could crib from them, and, you know, discussing African politics and so forth. But yeah, there was a lot of time to refine the writing because it took a very long time. Actually, it didn't take that long to find an agent. I mean, it took a couple of years to write the first version, and then about a year to find an agent. But it took a very long time to sell this book, which was mainly about a refugee from the Congo who ends up in Morocco, which is not an obvious subject for an American audience. And it really, it's funny that, you know, it's not funny, but it's telling that one of the first questions, or the first question I God, was about the Syrian refugee crisis, because it's really when that started happening, you know, at the scale that it happened, that people woke up and said, oh, you know, this topic of refugees, you know, is both topical, and it's pressing, and it's a burning topic. And it was at that point that my literary agent started getting interest from publishers. But it took 2 years of world, you know, took 2 years in a world refugee crisis, and basically millions of displaced people, for editors or publishing houses in the U.S. to kind of say, okay, this might be interesting, and Americans might be interested in it. And, you know, over that time, I started making more and more films. So, you know, I wrote the first version of this novel before I made the documentary Stop, which is a feature-length doc I made about the class action lawsuit against the New York City Police Department around stop and frisk. I followed the plaintiffs and the lawyers. And before I made this film for The Guardian about the refugee crisis, and I was making the film for The Guardian about the refugee crisis while I was rewriting the book. So, you know, I hope at least the writing also, and the plotting very much, became more cinematic and more, you know, plot driven and more exciting over the years. But yeah, but it's, you know, I've had 10 years to kind of smooth out the language.
Would you consider having the novel converted at some point, like into a cinematic version, or even perhaps as a play, some adaptations? I've seen novels adapted to plays, and plays adapted to films, and then all three across the way. But do you see it as, like, could definitely be a motion picture at some point?
I would hope it would be a long motion picture. I mean, a series.
That's fine. There have been many great long, Lawrence of Arabia.
Yeah.
So many. But
yeah, I have a producer friend who's reading it, so we'll see what she thinks. I mean, I think in very visual terms, you know, so I hope that especially the action sequences in the novel are cinematic. And it is, you know, it's a story of, I mean, I think it'd be a very expensive film to shoot because there's so much traveling, and, you know, there's kind of these assaults on barricaded Spanish cities, and, you know, crossing the Mediterranean and so forth. So to do it justice, you would have to have a pretty massive production. But, you know, I would love to see it as a film. I could see some of the scenes in the UNHCR too, with the banter and the discussions of human rights, and, you know, the refugees and what's going on. Maybe as a play, it might be interesting to excerpt it in that sense. But yeah, I mean, time will tell. You know, the book came out at the end of July, so it's been out for
2 months,
a month and a half now, yeah, or a little over a month and a half. So we'll see how it evolves. I mean, it's kind of out in the world right now.
Could I jump in with a question?
Sure, by all means.
We, a few years ago, were in Sicily on vacation, and we did meet a person that was a refugee.
Mm-hmm.
And I forget a lot of the specifics, like I can't remember what country she was from, and, you know, why she came. But the one thing that I do remember is that she was recruited from her little village, wherever it was, and made big promises of promised land, you know, in Italy. And so she had, you know, her family and whatever money they had, they gave to this organization, probably a criminal organization.
Yeah. And
transported her to the coast on the Mediterranean. And then they said, well, we need some more money. So whatever money she had to walk over to them. Otherwise, she couldn't get on the boat. And if she didn't have enough money, she had to call back to her family to send more money so she could get. Now, obviously, this was a sham and a criminal activity. Do you get into any of that in your book?
So, okay, so what you're describing is classic, unfortunately, and Yeah, I mean, it's, it's terrible, and it happens. I mean, it happens in South America and Central America too, but specifically and actually it happens to a lot of people who end up working in the United Arab Emirates and Dubai and what have you, where these kind of recruiters make big promises. And especially these days, they bring people to Libya, and regardless of what they paid or what their parents or village had paid them, they essentially enslave them or kidnap them, and they become indentured servants and either have to work for years to pay their passage north, or demand more money from the family with oftentimes threats of violence. I mean, it's really horrific. That is not the story of the main character, and that was actually something that wasn't really happening so much in 2009. So the novel begins in 1998 and ends in 2009, or maybe a little after. And because Morocco, for whatever racism it has, whatever difficulties the refugees encounter there, it's still a very, officially it's Africa's third biggest economy, because Nigeria is the biggest because of all its oil reserves, but it's not a real economy in any sense. I mean, it's really South Africa and Morocco that have developed service industries and are tied with Europe in a lot of ways. And this just didn't happen in Morocco. If this had been happening in Morocco, it would have been investigated and people would have been arrested. I mean, what's going on in Libya right now is it's just it's not a no man's land. I mean, it's a no man's land balkanized into warring factions controlled by militias. The government barely controls anything. And so the reports coming out of there are horrifying. And I met countless people on the French-Italian border coming from Libya who had been tortured. I met a kid who still had a bullet in him, which one of the doctors had to take out. So no, I mean, this is in the book. I mean, there's a lot of other things going on in Morocco that were pretty terrifying, especially these, one of the great problems for the refugees in Morocco was that regardless of whether they had a refugee card or not, they would often be attacked by the Moroccan police and summarily deported in violation of international law and dumped in this no man's land on the Moroccan-Algerian border, which has been officially closed since the 70s, and which is mainly controlled, strangely enough, by Nigerian gangs who would then abduct the refugees, or even the UN would have to pay ransoms to get them back. So similar but very different, not within Morocco, kind of in a I don't even know what to call this border, because it's outside of countries and it's controlled by nobody. And that's, that's what's happened in Libya today, and which is why things like this are happening. Yeah, I mean, I hope that answers the question.
Well, yes, it does. I just wondered how much of that you got into in the book. When obviously it was a different situation, but I do think it was Libya that she was taken to.
Yeah, I'd assume.
And at that particular time, she did get to Sicily, and that whole program was financed. I can't remember whether it was by the EU or by Italy itself. And since that time, I guess the program has stopped.
So this was an official program that she thought she was signing up for, and then she was essentially kidnapped?
No, what happened is when the boat arrived, she was rescued, I guess, by
right.
whatever it was. So that was never an official sanctioned crossing. It's just
right.
When they got there, they had a program to take care of these refugees.
Yeah. Well, that's still happening for the most part. I mean, what's going on in Greece right now, the reports out now are that they're illegally refouling, which means, deporting refugees arriving from Turkey back to Turkey, or just leaving them in international waters. But, if and when people arrive on Italian soil, either, especially in Lampedusa, which is south of Sicily, or in Sicily itself, they're required by international law to give them sanctuary and to process their asylum claims. You know, the situation right now is particularly grim because of the COVID pandemic, which has, you know, given Europe, rightfully or not, a pretext to really close their borders. So they're no longer, you know, they've kind of outlawed all the independent NGOs and rescue ships that were rescuing people in the Mediterranean. There's no good statistics right now on how many boats must have been lost this year, because the rescues are just not happening. So when people go out there, you know, their boats are sinking. Those boats that do make it, people are ending up in various camps. Obviously, again, because borders are closed, people are no longer being transferred out of the camps and redistributed. So as we saw in Lesbos, in the Moira camp, which should have, you know, which was constructed to hold 3,000 people, and I think at times it had upwards of 20,000. You know, the inhabitants of that camp just felt helpless and desperate at a certain point, and they burned it down. So yeah, it's just grim right now. I mean, it's grim if you're somebody, especially if you're somebody fleeing violence who can't go home and can no longer go forward. And that's actually a very big theme in my book. I mean, what happens to the main character and what happens to so many people who end up in Morocco is they try to get into Europe and they fail and fail again. And they're just trapped in this place where they can't go home, but they don't have working rights or residency permits, you know, whether they're recognized as refugees or not. And so they become kind of these prisoners desperate to break out. Which is, you know, elaborated on, and which leads to all these kind of different attempts to get into Europe that you see on the cover, basically, like in Melilla or in the sea.
Do you find, like, when the refugees were admitted and given pass into the new place to live, did they have like assistance where they would be helped assimilating to the new country, like getting used to things like customs and, you know, whatever, when someone comes from one situation and then moves to another, they just start to learn, like, you know, like when someone comes new to America and they learn language and, you know, how to.
Yeah, I mean, you know, in most European countries, the programs are really extensive. You know, even in Italy, where they're, you know, they're overloaded in respect to their resources. You know, people have been there for a while. They learn Italian, and they you know, they learn how to survive. There've been a lot of great videos coming out now about how the arrival of immigrants in Italy have been, or refugees have been, revitalizing dying towns. Italy has a lot of dying towns where all the young people have moved away.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's this kind of amazing renaissance going on thanks to the arrival of so many African refugees. You know, Germany is the best in that sense, and that was their gamble by taking 1 million Syrian refugees that people would assimilate or eventually go back. But you know, the nature, I mean, we know this from US statistics. I mean, in regards to immigrants in general, I mean, they work harder and longer and, you know, are more educated and commit less crimes than native residents of these countries. One thing we should also think about, which I was, you know, which is in respect to the people who are coming from Africa or the Middle East, from Syria or wherever, these are all essentially middle class and upper class Africans, at least in the African context. I mean, it's very, very expensive to pay a smuggler to bring you to Libya or to Morocco, and then to pay another smuggler to bring you across the Mediterranean. I mean, we're talking, 5,000 euros to 7,000 euros.
And the person could get cheated, and it's a dangerous trek, and all sorts of.
Yeah, but the poor actually can't make it out, basically. I mean, all the kids I was meeting in France, they all have cell phones, they speak several languages. I mean, a lot of them spoke English or French very well. These are kind of the middle-class educated elite that are leaving. There's something actually very ironic when people say, we should give aid and development to African countries or wherever so people will stop coming. I'm all for aid and development, but that will actually generate more refugees and migrants, because it will mean as the middle class grows, more people actually have the money to undertake this journey if they so choose. So, but the converse of that is also because they're middle class and educated, they have less trouble integrating. It actually means that, as people do fine and they have resources and, they have wherewithal. I mean, they're people who can make it through this trek. I'm going to say one last kind of ironic note that comes up in the book a lot is that actually the main immigrant country in all of Africa, the country that sends the most number of migrants to Europe, is actually Morocco. And it's mainly Moroccans who are going north. So there's this, we should remember that most migrants in Europe are from what's called the Maghreb, which is Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, and they live in this kind of liminal space of being both receiver countries and transit countries and also emitter countries, which is very true of Italy. Actually, I mean, and especially Sicily, which saw so many Italians go to the United States. And because the Italian economy has been poor over the last decade, there's this kind of exodus of young Italians who are all leaving Italy. And I think, now it's not so great with the present Italian government, but I think on the very local level, that is, encourage many Italians to be more hospitable to the migrants, and it's also inflamed tensions, which is hence the rise of the right-wing party. But there's, we should always keep in mind that all these countries that are receiving, are also emitting refugees, that we live in a very globalized world where people are coming and going. And this is kind of one of the themes of the novels too, that, the very category of refugee or migrant in many ways is a misnomer, because, it suggests, at least it gives the impression of these countries that are taking people are simply static and, their inhabitants are staying there. And that maybe we should come up with a better word or better terms for these things.
I thank you for being able to do this talk this evening as a great chat, and I wish you all the best in your future novel and film endeavors. And I'm looking forward to looking at the short film for The Guardian, and if anybody out there is interested, Spencer did a film a few years back called Stop, about the stop and frisk in New York City, and it was extremely well done. And I look forward to any future films or novels or plays that you have to put out.
I'll put the Amazon link to Stop in the conversation.
Sure.
So really, yeah, and thank you so much for hosting this talk, and for the questions and moderating, and the books at the library or elsewhere, and yeah, looking forward to
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Have a great night. Bye-bye.
Yeah.